Uh, so our second presentation is from Megan Bolton. She joined the Oregon Housing and Community Services as a senior research analyst in June 2015. In this role, Megan leads the research team's efforts to improve existing data collection methods, report on agency activities, understand statewide housing needs, and inform policy and planning decisions. Megan came to Oregon from Washington, D.C., where she worked for the National Low Income Housing Coalition for 6 years. As research director there, Megan was responsible for the National Low Income Housing Coalition's signature research report, Out of Reach, as well as many other resources used for affordable housing advocates and policymakers across the country. Prior to working for, and the acronym, I'm just going to go with it now, NLIHC, Megan was a portfolio analyst for the Low Income Investment Fund, and which I'm guessing is LIFE, which is kind of a cool acronym. LIF. Okay, so they should have gone with it. LIIF, a community development financial institution headquartered in San Francisco, California. She has a master's degree in public policy from George Washington University and a BA in anthropology from Penn State University. So without further ado, we welcome Megan.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Is this working, the mic, hopefully? Okay. Great. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. We at Oregon Housing and Community Services just about a month ago published our almost final draft of our statewide housing plan. This is sort of a, I don't know if people, I know they provided a link to kind of our site with the plan and full appendices and all our county profiles and all that lovely information. So we're really excited about the release of this, and this timing is really great because there is actually still kind of available for people a survey to provide public comments. So I encourage, if people have some pressing comments on the plan, you can go to the site that's listed at the end and fill out the survey. But I am going to, for this presentation, really focus on, so this has been a 1.5 year or so long process of our agency, along with a consultant, Eco Northwest, of doing kind of in-depth data analysis, doing listening sessions in 37 meetings across the state, doing a real kind of environmental scan of our funding sources and their flexibility and kind of where we can make changes to some of our funding sources, and then really strategizing internally as an agency and with partners on what our priorities should be for the next 5 years and how we're going to implement that work. So I'm going to really, in this presentation, focus on that needs assessment because we're researchers, and I think that's probably what you'll all be most interested in. At the end, I will kind of touch on the kind of 6 main priorities that kind of are a result of a lot of the analysis and listening sessions that we did, but I won't go into too much detail on those. So just to kind of start off really quickly, for those of you who may not know that much about Oregon Housing and Community Services, we are the state's housing finance agency, so we provide kind of both financial and programmatic support to create and preserve opportunities for quality, affordable housing for people with low to moderate incomes. We administer programs really for that kind of the whole spectrum of housing services. So from preventing and ending homelessness, we do some stabilization of households through energy assistance and weatherization, to financing and preserving, or financing the development and preservation of affordable rental housing, through opportunities for homeownership and foreclosure prevention. So that we kind of do that whole spectrum of services in our agency. And we really, do that primarily through grants, loans, contracts with community-based partners and providers and nonprofit developers, et cetera. So that's a little bit about us. So the plan, as I kind of already mentioned, began back in really the fall of 2017, I would say, is when we kind of really started on the data piece of this. And I already kind of mentioned we also did this tour of 30 to 37 communities across the state to do kind of a listening sessions. We did a few focus groups with particular groups like farm workers and some communities of color and residents of affordable housing and those searching or seeking services across the state. So kind of a number of different listening sessions and focus groups along with the more analytic data analysis. And then really went through the process of developing our priorities and strategies. And now the draft is out. And this, I should mention, this is really a 5-year plan, if I didn't mention that. So this is sort of these are going to be our priorities for the next 5 years. So in terms of the needs assessment, we really focused on the needs for our services. So really focused on those program areas, those topic issues that I just mentioned, from homelessness through homeownership. And we also really wanted to make sure that we were understanding how these challenges and needs differ from place to place. Obviously, Oregon, it's a big state. Things are different in rural Oregon than they are on the coast and in metro areas. So we wanted to be sure we sort of were visiting all of those places and really looking at the data kind of geographically, as well as for different demographics. So making sure that we were looking, kind of putting an equity lens on this, looking at how communities of color face some of these situations differently than others. Also making sure to look, and I have a whole list of special populations that we looked at, sort of understanding the needs of seniors, people with disabilities, people with mental illness, people being released from incarceration, et cetera. So there's kind of a lot of special populations with more specific housing needs, and we wanted to be sure that we were understanding those. So the primary data sources here, just a quick list. I'm not going to go through each one of these. A lot of it's American Community Survey data, just for some of the basic data we kind of collect on incomes, rents, demographics. Kind of one of the key things we're looking at is housing cost burden, how much of people's incomes are being spent on housing costs and energy costs, and so the ACS was used for a lot of that. What's nice about the ACS too is that we were able to look at some populations, so again, kind of look at how communities of color are affected differently than the white population, also look at, again, people with disabilities and the elderly population, as well as families with children through that data source. Also looked at some building permit survey, housing vacancy survey data, RMLS data, which is the regional multiple listing service, so on home values and home sales. CoreLogic data helps us look at foreclosure rates. The Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data helps us understand loan originations and reasons for denial of mortgages. The point-in-time counts I'll get into a lot, but that kind of helps us understand a little bit of the homeless population, as well as the Department of Education homeless students data. And then we used some internal data. Most primarily, we have an inventory of affordable rental housing, and that's not just OHCS-funded properties, but sort of any rental housing with some level of income or rent restrictions on it. And we'll get into the definition of affordable housing in a little bit, but that was a source that we used to understand the need for preservation of the existing stock. So just kind of overall, some kind of key takeaways from what's happening right now. Economic expansion has really driven increases in home prices and rents, but incomes have not kept up with some of those increases in the home prices and rents. There's been construction cost increases, tighter lending standards, and other factors that have really limited new housing supply, and we'll kind of look at that a little bit as well. Communities of color continue to face higher poverty rates and housing cost burdens, and there's a real attention right now to attention to housing as an issue, and there's kind of increased resources for affordable housing right now, so we really want to be sure we're being really cognizant of what others are doing and others who want to partner in kind of the work we're doing right now, because this is something we're hearing from kind of every agency we're talking to. They're kind of bringing up how housing is, a key concern. So let's just dig into some of we started with just sort of some of the overall market, what's happening in the housing market. And before I actually get into homeownership rates, kind of, I think we need to keep in mind that the population of Oregon is growing pretty rapidly, right? So, we're over 4 million now. From 2015 to 2016, Oregon was the 6th fastest growing state in the country, and, kind of have a growth rate that's well above the national growth rate right now. So we have a lot of people, we have a lot of population growth in Oregon, and at the same time, through this decade, homeownership rates have been declining, and this is sort of something that's been happening across the country since the foreclosure crisis. No exception here in Oregon. Oregon right now has the 9th lowest homeownership rate in the United States, and this is the result of a number of factors. Household growth was really stagnant for many years as a result of the recession. So new households weren't forming and looking for homes. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, sort of the tightening underwriting restrictions, which have limited access to home mortgages. And then we'll get into supply a little bit as well. So with the population growth and homeownership rates declining, this means like sort of a pretty big influx of people into the rental market. And that's really been having a pretty significant impact on rents. I think we all know that. So relatedly, so this is new residential permits. And this is where we can really see where the supply of housing is a big issue. So this shows us that the total number of new residential housing permits really plummeted from this high of over 30,000 in 2005 to a low of under 7,000 in 2010. It's going back up, right? So we're seeing this increase in housing permits and construction again. But that huge decline has really affected the market, and it's both in single family and in multifamily. So the green is the 5 or more units. That orange is the 2 to 4 units, and that's kind of an interesting market, that's sort of missing middle that people talk about sometimes. And then the blue is the single family units. So you can see that kind of from 2000 to 2006-ish, that single family permits were the bulk of new permits. That's changing now, so you can see, there's much more of the multifamily, which makes sense with what we're seeing in homeownership rates. But it's important to note that this is for the state overall. This is one of those things that varies pretty dramatically from place to place. If you look at it at the county level, a lot of those 5 or more units are really based in the Portland metro area. You're not seeing quite as much of it in other parts of the state. So this is the trend. We're seeing an increase, but there's a report that just came out from a group, Up for Growth, that kind of looked at underproduction and saw that from 2000 to 2015, there were 23 states that underproduced housing to the tune of about 7.3 million units. And Oregon was one of those, and they estimate that Oregon underbuilt by about 155,000 units during that 15-year period. So that's a big supply issue for us. And that affects vacancy rates and the market overall, right? So we have a real tight rental market. Oregon has actually, for a while there, we're not there now, but for a few years we had the second lowest rental vacancy rate in the country. I think it's more like 5th or 6th now, but still we're pretty historically low. It's been around 4%. Now it's a little higher, but so things are starting to ease up a little bit, but we still have really low rental vacancy rates, which obviously leads to increased rents, which we're seeing, of course, across the state. So that's sort of just a little bit of the background on what's been happening in the market. And so now we'll kind of move into the assessment piece, starting with homelessness, which certainly as we think about tight rental markets, the struggle that people have to afford rents, we know that there's been an increase in homelessness in Oregon kind of all across the state. So this map shows results of the point-in-time count from 2017. So this is a count that is done by continuums of care across the state. There's 7 continuums of care in Oregon. They're funded by HUD to kind of fund homeless services, rapid rehousing programs, and permanent supportive housing programs. So they organize these point-in-time counts on a night or a week, generally, in January. And I'll make sure to note that the point in time really is capturing people in shelters or in places not meant for habitation, so on the street, in cars, etc. I'll show you some homeless student data information in a little bit, and their definition is a little broader. It also includes people who are living doubled up with friends and family, so it's kind of a broader definition. The point in time does not count that in the official count, although some continuums do that kind of survey work as well. But what the point in time from 2017 showed is that there were about 14,000 people experiencing homelessness in Oregon. That's about a 6% increase from 2015. The unsheltered population is growing faster than the sheltered population, and in fact, Oregon has, I think it's the third highest rate of unsheltered homeless individuals in the country. And this is just showing also it's the percent of households experiencing homelessness as a proportion of all households in the county. And so it's really an issue statewide. Certainly a little bit more of bigger numbers and higher proportions in some of the metro areas and the coastal areas actually, but really is an issue statewide. And even where it says 0, we know that that's not really true. It's just that it's probably really hard for people to get out and count people, and it might be hard to find people in January. It's a weird time to do a point in time. But we know homelessness is an issue across the state and is on the rise. We also, one big concern is that Oregon also has the second highest rate of unsheltered people and families with children in the country. So it's 52% of families and children, families with children were unsheltered in 2017. And that's something that, you know, we as an agency and the governor in part of the budget and governor's kind of agenda on housing is really focused on, and something we're going to be working on with DHS around better serving families with children, particularly who are experiencing homelessness. The other thing I'll point out here is that we have about 3,387 people who are chronically homeless, and this means that they're homeless individuals with a disability who have either been continuously homeless for a year or more, or have experienced homelessness at least 4 times over 3 years. So just sort of that, somebody who just continues to kind of enter the system and is struggling, and that's about 25% of the population. About 1 in 4 people are chronically homeless, and certainly a much higher percentage of the chronically homeless tend to be unsheltered. As I mentioned, there's also data from the Department of Education on homeless students. And again, this is a broader definition, so this includes children who are doubled up with friends and family. But the Department of Education showed about 22,500 homeless students for the 2016 to 17 school year. About 17,000 of those were in that doubled up situation. And then the others were either in motels, unsheltered, or in shelters. And that was a 5.6% increase from the previous school year, and it had been, I think, the 4th year of increases in a row. The new numbers did just come out, and they are a little bit lower, which is a promising trend, although when you look at it, that decrease primarily actually comes in the doubled up, and there was a small increase in the unsheltered, so that's concerning. So again, sort of showing that this is an issue across the state. And in fact, for this data particularly, there are a lot of rural areas seeing high proportions of their students experiencing homelessness. And then last on homelessness, we kind of, again, broke this down by kind of some subpopulations and by race and ethnicity. And this is where we can see that, in particular, where the red is, so, you know, African Americans, for instance, make up 6% of the homeless population, while making up only about 1.8% of the overall population in Oregon. Same with Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, and people of 2 or more races are really disproportionately represented in the homeless population. And this is something, you know, in our outreach, we really heard from folks that the discrimination in the housing market can make it really difficult for people of color to find housing. And we also heard, we'll get to this when we talk about quality a little bit, but that people were, you know, there are particular groups who are especially afraid of kind of mentioning anything about the quality of their units or anything, issues with landlords for fear of being evicted and not having anywhere else to go. And that's across the board. We also looked at a few other groups. I'll kind of point to veterans specifically. As another group that we are really focused on, and as an agency right now, again, overrepresented in the homeless population. Also, Oregon has the 5th largest number of homeless veterans in the country, but just the 25th largest number of veterans overall. So again, just a real kind of overrepresentation of that group here in Oregon. So one of the primary solutions to homelessness, and particularly chronic homelessness, really, is permanent supportive housing. And what that really is it's non-time limited affordable housing with wraparound supportive services for people experiencing homelessness, and particularly for those with disabilities or mental illness, and for those who are chronically homeless. So we this kind of pie is a lot of populations there. But this is from the Corporations for Supportive Housing, who did sort of an estimate of need for permanent supportive housing units. And what they really found were that the largest needs come from the chronically homeless population, the aging. We know that the homeless elderly are going to double by 2050, and their health degenerates more quickly than with non-homeless elderly. Also, the prison population, so people being released from jail and prison is a high need population. And then individuals with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that's the IDD, is another sort of large group with need for permanent supportive housing. So as we talked about a lot of these groups, it became more and more evident for a need for us as an agency to focus some attention on permanent supportive housing, and we've been doing a lot of work around that with OHA and other partner agencies across and organizations across the state. Okay, so moving into rental housing now, I want to quickly kind of do let's talk about what affordable housing really means, because people talk about this differently. So when I say affordable housing, I mean that people are not spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And that can be naturally occurring housing on the market. It can be housing that has some level of subsidy or public funding that has an income or rent restriction on it. But that is sort of the general rule for affordable housing. So there are some programs that we run, actually most of them, for instance, the low-income housing tax credit, which is sort of one of our biggest programs. It has, a requirement that the owners set rents that are affordable to people at 50% of median family income or 60% of median family income. But if somebody who is at 40 or 30% of area median income is living in those units, it is not necessarily affordable to them. It is not affordable to them. So I just want to kind of make that clear. Just because it's a low-income housing tax credit property doesn't actually necessarily mean it is affordable to all of the households living there. And sometimes there is a need for additional rental subsidies like vouchers to kind of make it truly affordable to some of the households. But this just kind of talks about some different, so 0 to 30% of area median income might be somebody on Social Security or maybe a full-time minimum wage earner. They can really, if we're talking about affordable housing, they can really afford rents up to $500 a month. For people at 30 to 60% of area median income, they can afford up to about $1,000 a month, and then for those up to 80% are a little closer to what the median rent in Oregon rate. And that's what I have up top there is from Zillow's rent estimates of $1,649 median rent for a home in Oregon as of October of 2018. So you can kind of see how difficult it would be for some of these income groups to afford that level of rent. Again, like I said, one of the kind of key indicators we look at is what's called housing cost burden. This is, if somebody is considered to have housing cost burden if they are paying more than 30% of their income on rent. They are considered to have severe cost burden if they're spending more than 50% or half of their income on rent. And that's severe housing cost burden can be a real kind of indicator that someone might be at risk of homelessness, especially if they are in the lowest income groups. It means they have very, very little left over at the end of the month for other basic necessities. So this kind of breaks down the housing cost burden by income level, and obviously we can see that the extremely low income households are most likely to experience that severe housing cost burden, with 81% of folks in that group experiencing that. And that's really gone up. So severe housing burden was about, for kind of all renters, was at about 19% in 2000. It's now over a quarter of all renters. It's up to 27% of all renters have severe housing cost burden now, which is a significant increase. Really quickly, this is also showing housing cost burden by race and ethnicity. So again, we can sort of see this disproportionality of communities of color experiencing higher, particularly severe housing cost burden than white households. So for instance, African Americans, 65% of, and this is of renters below 60% median family income, I should make clear. That's sort of one of the main thresholds for our programs is 60% of MFI, so that's why we used it here. So 65% of African American households have severe housing cost burden compared to 55% of white households. And I also want to kind of, so this is a quick map of, again, so this is now all renters with severe burden across the state. And one thing I want to point out here is something that Oregon's Office of Economic Analysis, kind of an analysis they did recently on rural affordability. They found that median household incomes in the rural kind of United States overall are really similar to Oregon's median household incomes at around $42,000 a year. But the home values in rural Oregon are at about 30% higher than in rural US. So it's in rural US, the home values are around $95,000, and in rural Oregon, it's about $150,000. And similarly with rents, rural Oregon's median rents are 16% higher than in the rural United States. So there's this real issue, like we often talk about housing being more affordable in rural areas and incomes being lower. And it's true that they're lower, but as kind of compared to the rest of rural United States, they have significantly higher housing costs, but the same level of income. So it's a real struggle, even in rural counties, and this is certainly something we heard, everywhere we went, people talked about unaffordable housing. And we'll get to this in a little bit, but particularly in rural Oregon, there was a lot more concern about housing quality. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So another thing we looked at was kind of the shortage of units, and this gets to supply a little bit, and kind of this mismatch of renters and units. So what we can see from this chart is that, so I'll focus on the 30% MFI group. There are about 130,000 extremely low-income renters in that 0 to 30% of MFI group, but only 26,000 units that are affordable to them and actually being occupied by them or vacant, and then another close to 17,000 that are affordable but are being occupied by a higher income household. So there's really this gap of about 85, almost 86,000 units for this income group. And then you see there's a gap for people from 30 to 50%, and then really there's kind of actually a surplus for people in the 50 to 80% bracket. This is sometimes hard because really these units are affordable to these households, and these units are affordable to these households, and it's all a little bit confusing. But what it really tells us is that the shortage is extreme, and that it's most severe for extremely low-income households, and we can look at this. So this is again for the state. We did look at this at the county level, which I'll just go to this next map. Because this really varies. At a statewide level, some of those affordable units are in rural areas, or they're poor quality, or they're really far away from services. So that's kind of an important one to look at and understand at a more localized level. So this map is showing the number of affordable and available units per 100 households for folks at 30% of median family income. So for instance, we can see that in Multnomah County, there are 20 affordable and available units for every 100 extremely low-income renter household. And the highest that's on this map, I think, is 29. So, really throughout the state, a real shortage of units. Now, housing conditions isn't this one's a tricky one to get good data on from American Community Survey. There's something called the American Housing Survey that has really in-depth data on housing quality, but it's really only good at the state level and for maybe a Portland metro area. But we know that It's a big issue, and again, especially in rural areas. There's a lot of the housing stock that was built before 1980, and so the risk of lead-based paint hazard is greater in that time period. And this is where we heard a lot of people saying that because of the housing crisis, they really feel they can't complain about housing conditions because there's nowhere else to go. And I also want to note here that this is a big issue in manufactured housing, which is a really important stock of affordable housing, especially again in rural areas, and something we're really focused on right now in terms of both preserving manufactured home parks and kind of doing repair and replacement of those parks and homes. But that's a stock where about 55% of manufactured homes were built before 1980. And so that's something we're focused on, because it is also kind of a part of our weatherization program is really focused on replacing and weatherizing both manufactured homes and kind of multifamily and single family homes as well, which sort of takes us into the next graph. We did look at, along with sort of housing quality and pre-1980 units, looked at energy burden for households at or below 60% of median family income. Energy burden, similar to housing burden, is what percentage of your income you're spending on energy costs. Here, an energy burden is if you're spending 6% of your income on energy costs. Severe energy burden is if you're spending 10%. So this is another thing. We're looking at this, and we're looking at energy burden in combination with a number of other factors for some of the work we're doing around the need for weatherization services across the state. And then finally, moving into home ownership. So as we talked about home ownership rates declining across the state, they declined really among almost every racial and ethnic group in Oregon. This shows a comparison from 2005 to 2016. And we know people of color experience disproportionately low homeownership rates compared to white households, with the homeownership rates ranging from, I think, 26% among Pacific Islanders to 63% among Asian households. And actually, I think I didn't update this. I think I put in the 2017 data. But at any rate, it's fairly similar between 2016 and 2017. For the Asian population, I think it's important here to note that disaggregation is really important. So it often looks like the Asian population is doing better than other communities of color. But when you kind of disaggregate that data, we can see actually that the homeownership rate among the Cambodian population in Oregon is just 33%. And it goes all the way up to 71% among the Vietnamese population. For most of this Asian subpopulations, so for Thai, Korean, and Filipino and Japanese, it's all in like the 52 to 57% range. So this is just something, as we kind of advancing racial equity as one of the priorities, and we want to be sure we're working with culturally specific organizations to understand how we better do outreach for our programs to particular communities. And for something like the Asian population, we want to make sure we're understanding where the differences are among subpopulations in that community. And another thing we looked at around homeownership was borrower outcomes for home purchases. This comes from the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data. So the majority of kind of each racial and ethnic group had their loans originate or kind of go through, successfully turn into a mortgage. But there are groups that were denied at a higher rate than others. So the largest percentage of home applications denied occurred for the American Indian or Alaska Native population, and then followed by the Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander population. And so we know that changes made to underwriting standards as a result of the housing crisis have disproportionately affected low-income households who might have higher debt-to-income ratios and lower credit scores. And certainly we also know that, not just recently, but there's a long, long history of discrimination in the housing market and an inability of particular communities to accumulate generational wealth, and all of that plays into what we see here. And there is a lot of work being done right now at our agency and kind of in the state on the whole on looking at how to reduce racial disparities in home ownership. And so we're involved in some of that work. And again, it's one of our key priorities. So as I said, this is sort of the full list of, we have sort of in the full appendix to the state plan, we have sort of statements of need for each of these populations. For the ones at the top, we were able to kind of use some American Community Survey data to look at housing cost burden, et cetera, but for many of the others, it was more kind of working with other state agencies to understand some of the data and doing some kind of just need statements based on other research done on what the needs of these populations are. But a really consistent theme for most of these groups is really related to the need for permanent supportive housing. Not for every group here, but for many it can be a real pathway to success and to stabilizing these households. So, so that all of that data analysis plus more that I didn't go into really led to the 6 priorities that are laid out in the plan. So the first, as I kind of have mentioned, is around equity and racial justice. And for each of these kind of priorities, we have a goal, and then there's kind of implementation strategies associated with them. So this is really going to be about collaborating with partners and stakeholders to create a shared understanding of racial equity. The hope is that communities of color will experience increased access to OHCS resources and achieve greater parity in housing stability, self-sufficiency, and homeownership. So we're going to be, some of the kind of possible implementation strategies for this are creating and maintaining a system to analyze our program and practices and remove identified barriers to access and opportunity within our programs to ensure equitable outcomes. We're going to try to meaningfully engage culturally specific and culturally responsive organizations to ensure that our programs and program awards are designed to advance equity and meet the needs of communities of color, and to try to strengthen our relationships with tribal leaders and leverage resources to address disparities in tribal housing issues. The second priority is around homelessness. We really want to, so this is an area where we can really work to become more of a convener. There's a lot of efforts across the state going on that are sort of disjointed at the moment, very honestly, and so we want to sort of take a stronger leadership role in convening agencies across the state in our efforts to prevent and end homelessness. And the focus, at least for the 5 years, is going to be on unsheltered children and families and veterans. And we already have some work going with both VA and DHS on these efforts. And I will say another big piece of this one is data. And that's a kind of been a tricky one, just because like I said, there's 7 continuums of care in the state, and they all do use a homeless management information system, an HMIS system, to collect data. And that is great, but we're not the statewide administrator for that system. The Portland Housing Bureau is, and so we don't have much access to that information and data, and they aren't necessarily kind of coming together to look at that data and analyze it at a statewide level, and so that's something we are really interested in figuring out how we move forward, figuring out how we kind of create a governance structure for that system and how we can play, again, more of a leadership role there and do some statewide analysis. I know there's been interest from many agencies in sort of sharing that data, and that's been tricky because we don't sort of own it or have access to it, but we're going to be working on, and we've been working on and continue to work on ways to share that data, perhaps to the Integrated Client Services Data Warehouse that DHS and OHA host, or in other ways, because we know this is a really critical piece to a lot of people's work, to understanding who's homeless, where they're homeless, what where they're coming from and where they're exiting to, and if people are being successfully housed and what their outcomes are post kind of services. So that's a big goal of ours. We've talked a lot about permanent supportive housing, so that's a big goal of ours. The goal is to create 1,000 or more permanent units of permanent supportive housing in the next 5 years, and we've been working really closely with OHA on that, because we can build the units, but it's really, really critical that we have those wraparound supportive services attached to those units, because that's what makes this successful. For affordable rental housing, we're working to triple our existing pipeline of affordable rental housing, so up to 25,000 homes. Our pipeline right now is the highest it's ever been at around 7,800 units, I think. So we're working to do even more. And along with creating new, I should say, there's also work to be, there's a lot of work being done right now around a preservation strategy for existing units that may be coming up on their expiration dates. Around homeownership, we're going to be assisting at least 6,500 households in becoming successful homeowners and increase the number of homebuyers of color in our homeownership programs by 50%. We're exploring a lot of new program ideas around homeownership, and so that's really exciting for our agency. And then finally, we have a priority on rural communities, because as I mentioned, all of the issues that we discussed or looked at are really an issue everywhere, but I think so often our programs are somewhat tailored or work better for the metro areas, and so we really want to be more kind of intentional about how we work with rural communities and how we understand what their particular needs are and how we kind of meet those needs. So whether that's around capacity and other issues and kind of collaboration and, you know, TA, whatever it needs to be, we want to be sure that we are facilitating that work. And so again, this is kind of about doubling the pipeline of projects in rural Oregon. So those are the main priorities. And so this last slide is my contact information. This also includes the link to the survey that's out right now. Our housing integrators are out right now. I think they're doing about 6 more kind of listening sessions or kind of comment sessions around the state to get feedback from people on the plan, on the draft plan. And then the hope is that the final version, after kind of taking in some of those comments, will be published in early 2019. I think January or February is the goal. So that's the plan. Thank you. And I should just quickly mention that I think, you know, the governor's budget for the 2019 to 2021 biennium really supports a lot of this, which is great. So there are additional investments for a number of programs that very directly tie to a lot of these priorities and goals. So that should help us accomplish them, hopefully. So yeah, any questions? Yes, hi.
What is the share of people that experience homelessness that are coming from outside of Oregon here in Oregon? That's the first one.
Yeah.
And then the second question that I have is I'm really curious to learn about your thoughts on urban growth boundary and how it affects the affordable housing in Oregon.
So to the first question, so this gets to my lack of access to data. I wish I could answer that with a very specific number, but I can't. But I know that it's less than people think. And I don't know the exact share, but I know that that's a common kind of thread that you hear, that there are a lot of people coming from other states to Oregon to access homeless services. And some of the continuums have sort of looked at that internally, and often it's in some continuums, they all do different questionnaires for their point in time counts. But some of them ask, where are you coming from? And the vast majority are really are kind of from that county or that region, or at least from Oregon. It's a pretty small number that's coming from out of state, to your first question. But that is something that I hope that once again, if we get more access to data and are kind of able to do our own analysis of it, can really kind of pinpoint. Yeah. With urban growth boundaries, so just generally, so we're working with, we've been doing a lot of work lately with DLCD on planning in general and issues around land use. And one of the bills that was passed last year, I'm forgetting, I think it was HB 4006 or something, kind of directs cities with more than 25% of their 25% of households who are severely cost burdened, to kind of start really making directed plans to address that issue. And one of the things I think all of the cities are going to be looking at is urban growth boundaries and zoning and things like that. It affects, it gets back to supply. It gets to, the lack of the ability to build, the need to kind of build more dense housing because we have a limited supply of land. So I think it all kind of comes back to that limited supply. And we'll see what a lot of cities and what others come up with in terms of addressing that issue. Yeah?
So the pattern of permit applications
Yeah.
like it was prior to the Great Recession and prior to the housing crash and after was really remarkable.
Yes.
You talked about a number of reasons why builders are not applying for permits to the same degree. And I wonder about the psychological impacts of the crash and whether, a lot of the things you listed have to do with demand and lending difficulties and permit difficulties, but I mean, to what extent are private sector companies just not taking the share of risk that they were taking prior to, and they're seeing this as an advantageous opportunity to say, we need concessions for us to go out there and conduct business as usual.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what that, but I think you're absolutely, I mean, you're right. I think that there were, those contributed to that drop off in supply or in new residential permits. I don't know to what extent, but that's an interesting thing to look at. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have a longer term graph on that? Because I mean, we're looking at peak to trough in some ways regarding that. Because 2006-08 was the peak of the last boom here. I mean, that's when we were talking about, eliminating some of the urban or building restrictions and whatnot. So, if we had a
Longer
through the
term
70s or
trends,
something when we actually started along this path.
I can't remember. I feel like I went back as far as I could find the data, at least. So I was trying to do it to match it to where I could do it on the county level. And for the county level, I think that's as far back as it went. But for the state level, I think it goes back quite a bit further. And I know that, again, the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis, I think, has looked at some of those trends much further back than that to kind of, better understand those trends. Yeah.
So has there been any push to look at cooperative-based ownership solutions rather than single-family ownership solutions?
There have. So I think we're exploring all options right now. And I know so one of the things, we have a new source of funding called LIFT. It's Local Innovative Fast Track Housing. In our first round of LIFT awards, it was only for rental housing, but in the second round, we did homeownership, new development of homeownership as well. And some of those are kind of related to co-ops. And I know that some of the partners we've worked with, I'm sorry, do you remember who? There's some partners. Is it PCRI or Proud Ground?
Yeah, Proud Grounds and Habitat for Humanity.
And Habitat, right.
The largest for lift homeownership and then the co-ops and manufactured housing.
Right. CASA of Oregon. So yes, we're looking at it, and I think we did very little in this last round around development of new homeownership, but we looked at those models, and I think are hoping to do more of that in coming years.
Cooperative subsidization with zoning ordinances like Minneapolis, where they recently made it no single-family development.
Zoning,
That's a very powerful tool to achieve these goals in combination.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
So this is kind of a statewide issue where issues are different locally, or like problems, causes, and solutions are different locally. Is there, in your listening tours and stuff, is there a community that you think should be singled out because they're dealing with this creatively or really thinking, seriously about these issues that you've worked with?
Well, it varies from topic to topic. So for instance, Lane County is doing really amazing work around the homelessness solution. So they're doing, just on the local level, a lot of data sharing. So they're really identifying, it's called FUSE, and I don't remember what that stands for, but it's sort of, their homeless services are working with kind of with the hospitals and with the prisons, and they're identifying high high kind of risk, high utility, high users of the systems, and they are working with them, case management, kind of all working together to get them exactly what they need and what might be most beneficial to them. And so it's this great kind of collaboration of coordinated entry and getting people kind of through the right system. So I would, so for me, that's been a great example of kind of the way to address like chronically homeless and some of the other issues in Lane County. I'm trying to think of in other topic areas. I mean, I think there's a lot of good examples of, I mean, right now, when we look at some of our recent awards of both kind of lift rental housing and low-income housing tax credits, there's just a lot of examples of, I think what's really key right now is a lot of places are doing a really good job of partnering with other agencies and other local organizations and community organizations and organizations that are providing services. I think that's starting to become a really important model, and it's working really well. And I feel like a lot of the awards we've been giving out recently are have really been rewarding. I think even in our applications are more rewarding those types of projects. And so that's happening in a lot of places. So some of those awards are in Portland, but some of them are on the coast, and there's been some in Marion County, kind of all over the state. We've been seeing a lot more of that work, which is really encouraging. Yeah.
Sort of getting at maybe some potential structural problems that maybe lead to or people being either in states of homelessness or living in low-income housing. I'm wondering, have you done research into sort of generational low-income housing? So maybe people that you help out or people that grow up in low-income housing, I'm guessing there's a great propensity for them to live in low-income housing sort of moving forward. And I'm wondering if maybe if you guys have looked into it, maybe guidance that we could provide to our local communities to help sort of address some of those structural issues?
Yeah. We have not. So this is something I think we really want to push on. And another thing we really want to push towards in the next 5 years is quite simply doing a better job of analyzing our own internal data. So we have historically had a research team of about 1. Now we have 4, so it's very exciting. But we also have had really old systems, and we have not focused on sort of data collection and outcome measures and things like that, which we're really pushing towards. So we actually are now just moving all of our data on multifamily rental housing residents and property data to a new system. And we're also, again, trying to get better data on the homeless services side of things. But I think that kind of work is something we're, as a research team, really interested in. And we've been talking a lot with program staff around kind of better ways of tracking people who are using our services and understanding kind of their, what their outcomes are, if they are indeed being stabilized, if they're leaving the properties, where are they going? Are they kind of able to buy a home? Are they falling back into homelessness? Are they moving to a better place? Did they get, kind of having a better understanding of that? And I think one of the things we, again, want to really be able to do is share our data as well with other agencies, so that we're not just focused in on, their housing, but what are some of their other, what are the other services that they're accessing, and what are other outcomes they might be having. So that's something we've not been there, but we really are kind of pushing over the next 5 years to do a lot more of that type of analysis. Yeah.
Term like homefulness to replace this. I mean, people can be homeless, but you're aiming for homefulness or homeownershipness, starting to put a positive spin on the marketing aspect of that.
I haven't. We mostly talk about housing stabilization as a positive. Is that positive enough for you? Okay. stabilizing families and them retaining housing and having positive outcomes. Yeah.
Do you know off the top of your head what the ratio of like vacant housing to unhoused persons or unhoused households is in Oregon?
I don't off the top of my head. I could probably look that up though. Yeah.
Nationally, it's like 5 to 1, right? Like, so I wonder if there's any like talk around kind of investment property tax changes that would alter the incentives of people to hold those properties vacant.
I don't know. I don't feel like those are in our discussions, but it's an interesting idea. Yeah.
So we had one more question, and then I'm going to let people pack up and head out.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming you're willing to stay
Sure,
for a few minutes
for
if
sure.
people have additional questions. I think it was your question.
Oh, sorry.
For example, do you share information with other states or other cities? Seattle raised the minimum wage to $15 or something. What did that do for homelessness, for example?
I haven't talked directly with them. I know. So one thing that actually our executive team just came back from a West Coast HFA convening. So that's another thing we're doing is trying to do a lot more outreach to other HFAs on the West Coast. So Washington and California and Oregon are meeting now quarterly to talk about kind of what's happening in each of our respective states around legislature and how it's having an effect. But I can't answer that directly in terms of what the minimum wage has done to Seattle's homelessness issue.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you all again for attending our fall 2018 SOAR event. We hold these quarterly, so again, if it's your first time, we do hope to see you guys in the future. And members of the executive committee will likely be hanging around the back table if you have any questions about SORA, what membership is, or anything like that. Thank you.
We'll resend the link